Hello and welcome to Red Horizons. I'm a historian interested in the history of empires and their discontents. And today we're watching an American anti-communist propaganda piece from 1948 called Make Mine Freedom. So why are we watching this propaganda piece? Why would a historian be interested in propaganda? It's not exactly a good source, but it's my contention that actually propaganda is not about convincing the other side that you're correct. So the idea isn't that a communist in 1948 would go into a cinema in America, watch this and leave going, oh my, capitalism is the way forward. Instead, I think propaganda is much more important as a way to convince your side that they are on the right side of history. So the idea of this cartoon is that someone who is already kind of pro-America, pro-capitalism, would go in and then leave thinking, wow, we're the good guys. And in that way, propaganda provides a valuable tool for a historian to kind of get a window into how Americans viewed themselves at the beginning of the Cold War. So let's get into it. As a historian, it's always important to kind of check up on who are the people who are involved in producing this propaganda piece. This is produced by an organisation called Harding College. Now, this group is a conservative Christian college based in the US state of Arkansas, and the 1940s is a period where they're trying to transform their image a little. So when they were founded in the 1920s, they were pretty isolationist. They were very suspicious of the idea of America being involved abroad, especially in places like Europe. And in the 1940s, what they're really trying to do is they're becoming much more comfortable with the American mission of creating a world safe for democracy. And as part of this shift, we're seeing a lot of them produce propaganda pieces just like this.
America is many things to many people. To a 17-year-old kid, it's the malt shop on the corner. To Grandpa, it's the front porch in the cool of the evening. To Mother and her family, it's church on Sunday morning. And to Dad, it's his favorite relaxation.
So we're starting here with an idealized view of what Harding College and the creators of this piece view as America. And it should be noted that while we have lots and lots of different characters, all of them are white. Not a single person of colour appears in this entire clip. And this is pretty typical of depictions of America in this time period. Churches were all across the country either segregated by law or de facto segregated. I mean, even till this day, there is this saying that Sunday morning is one of the most segregated periods in America.
Crabtree Corners, and it's the tycoons in Wall Street. It's all races, creeds, and religions.
We have this shot of a multiracial classroom. Now, I think this is pretty fascinating because this classroom we are seeing is pretty much in 1948 a fantasy of the creator of this cartoon's creation. We are still several years out from Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Across the South, we have, by law, segregated schools. And while it is true in the North and in the West, there isn't really laws against integrated schools, de facto on the ground, most schools are one or the other race due to a whole host of informal segregation. In fact, in Harding College, the university that is producing this, it would not integrate until 1962, making it one of the first higher education institutes in the state of Arkansas to do so. So this clip of a multiracial classroom is one that you would not see in the college that this propaganda piece is being produced. So why are they doing this? Well, because in the 1940s, segregation in America is starting to give America a bad name abroad. So 1940s, 1950s, we're seeing the beginnings of the process of decolonization in places like Africa, in places like Asia. And the Soviet Union, the greatest rival of America in this beginning Cold War period, are starting to make a lot of hay out of the fact that black people, if they were to go to America, would have a pretty second-class citizenship. And so what is happening is organisations like the CIA, the State Department, and NGOs like the one that are producing this film are making a concerted effort to try and portray America as much more racially integrated and harmonious than it actually on the ground was.
Freedom of speech and to peaceably assemble. Freedom to own property. security from unlawful search or...
Again, what I would say, the only thing I would say about these are again very reliant on you being white person of a certain class. Like if we were to tell a black civil rights campaigner in 1940s Alabama that they had freedom of speech, freedom of voting, and freedom from unfair arrest, I think they would be a bit confused.
These freedoms that have made America strong.
Okay, so we got our freedom. But management's lousing up everything.
Labor is at fault. It's ruining the country.
My constituents, as your elected representative, I can assure you Labor's right, management's right. I'm strictly neutral.
Labor, management, politicians, phooey. They can't tell corn from oats.
It only takes the money out of my pocket.
So we're getting here a portrayal of basically the New Deal coalition here. So the New Deal coalition was an organisation that was brought about by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 to drive the Democrats to success, electoral success. And it was a combination of Labour, it was a combination of farming interests in the South, of political interests, and also some business interests. And by the 1940s, this was becoming increasingly contentious among conservatives. There was this feeling that what FDR had brought in was just leading to strife. It was leading to a lot of conflict between management and between the Vox Populi, the great unwashed below them.
Hurry, step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, ism.
Ism is basically a stand-in for communism, right? That's what he's selling here. I think it should be noted how racially otherized Dr. Utopia is. So for one thing, his skin is much darker than the other characters in this scene. For the other thing, he is wearing a zoot suit, so the clothing he's wearing is called a zoot suit. In the 1940s, this was a clothing style that was particularly popular among racial minorities, particularly black people, Mexicans, Italian Americans, the Japanese community in America were wearing zoot suits. So we're really meant to recognise ism here as a foreign influence. He is here trying to corrupt white people with his foreign ideas of ism.
I hereby turn over to Ism Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ism promises to take care of me forever.
Pardon me.
And who are you, my good man?
I'm John Q. Public.
Ah, my fine friend, you're just in time to share this generous and gigantic offer. Sign right here.
Mind if I read it first?
So here we have a character, John Q. Public, who's obviously a stand-in for the American people, right? So we have this reoccurring theme throughout 20th century American political history, which is the idea that the American people know what's best. And if we just got rid of the politicians, we got rid of the union barons, we got rid of the moneyed interests, the American people would know what's right.
System of free enterprise isn't perfect. But before we throw it away for some imported double talk, let's turn the clock back a few years to see what it's done for us. For example, back in the 1890s, Joe Dokes was just a guy who liked to tinker around his barn. And because he was free to dream his dream and tinker, Joe had a chance to make something of himself and his idea. So, when Joe's friends and relatives used their savings to help him buy tools and property, they were capitalists. Don't blush, folks. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Because capital, management, and labor worked together, Joe's idea grew. It grew and did things even he never dreamed of.
As far as I can tell, though, I think Joe Dokes is a fictional character, but his life story seems to have certain parallels with Henry Ford, who in the 1890s, as this clip suggests, set to work as an engineer with investment from various people he knew to build up the modern popular car manufacturing system. I don't really know why they didn't just use Henry Ford's story. Like, he has quite a compelling story. He is a gifted engineer. I mean, unlike Joe Dokes, I suppose, he doesn't really do it in his back garden. He does it at a factory. He is a trained engineer. I suppose the only reason I can think they didn't include Ford is that by 1948, the thing he was most famous for was being a pretty vicious anti-Semite, which had kind of went out of fashion after World War II. So maybe that's why they decided to fictionalize his story.
The automobile industry provides millions of jobs that never existed before. And remember, this is a story of only one industry. There are thousands more scattered all over the United States whose history of development is pretty much the same.
I mean, I suppose this is true to a certain extent. It should be said that a lot of key industries in the United States, like most famously the railways, wouldn't have really been possible without massive government investment as well, and also tax breaks and things like that. So this video is maybe suggesting it's a bit more simplistic, the growth of American economy in the 1940s than it was.
We've built a country under the American system that sends more young people to high school and college than all the rest of the world combined. Why, even in the Depression, our wages bought more food, clothing, travel, and entertainment than the wages of any other people in the world. Our country has a national income equal to the total national incomes of any other 6 nation in the world. With only 7% of the Earth's we drive 70% of the world's automobile.
So in 1948, this is true. America does dominate the world economy to a massive scale. What the suggestion here seems to be this is because of American system of capitalism. I think more in at least the 1940s, this probably has to do with things like the Second World War. So the Second World War was a pretty massive cataclysm that destroyed most of the world's largest economies prior to the war. So after World War II, the economies of much of Europe and much of Asia were completely destroyed. The process of decolonization was also quite disruptive for a lot of places like Africa and India, for instance. And so one of the reasons that America is so dominant in the world is they are one of the few industrial bases that have not been completely flattened by World War II. It should also be said that one of the reasons that Americans had such high spending during the Depression, which is also true, is not really, again, because of investments in people like Joe Dokes. It's much more to do with the New Deal coalition coming in. So FDR, one of the reasons he's elected in 1932 is his predecessor has been pretty negligent when it comes to providing, say, jobs and security. We have like cities of homeless people basically camped out in Washington, D.C. And one of the things FDR and his administration do is they start public works programs, which really get people back to work. And this has a massive boost on the American economy into the 30s. And then the massive production drive going into World War II also boosts productivity.
To see what you'd get in exchange for your freedom. Go ahead, try it.
You can't do this to me! I'll strike!
The state forbids strikes.
Wait till the union hears about this!
Ah, yes, the union. Welcome to our ranks, number 1313.
So this is pretty interesting because it is true that in the 1940s and early 1950s is probably the high point of American union power. But it wasn't really because of the system of capitalism as our main character, John Q. Public, is suggesting. Actually, very recently in the 1930s, union fights with the bosses had actually been very, very violent. They had spilled over into actual battles with guns and airplanes. I mean, maybe I'll leave a link to some information about the West Virginian Coal Wars if you're interested in learning more about this. But again, one of the reasons that the unions are having such a good time of it in the 1940s is because of this New Deal coalition. As part of the New Deal coalition, they really start using their power to advance labour interests. And this is like actually a fairly brief period in American history. By the late 70s and then into the 80s as Reagan comes in, a lot of these rights are stripped away. So what I would say is, yes, this video is correct. 1948 is a real high point of labour power, but I would say it's not really because of the American capitalistic system. Instead, I would probably argue that it's actually despite it.
The farm folks will put a stop to this.
Farmers don't vote anymore.
What'll they do for seed next year?
You won't have to worry about next year. The state will do your planning from now on.
So I think it's easy from 2022 to look at this and say, oh, this is probably a critique of Soviet collectivization. And I mean, maybe it is, but I think also we could read it as a critique of the Truman administration. So farmers are an organisation which are really, by this period, definitely rubbing up against the New Deal coalition. So 1946 is the creation of the Bureau of Land Management, which is going into large chunks of the West and really regulating what farmers can and cannot do. And this is a result of something called the Dust Bowl, where this is a massive environmental catastrophe that takes place in the 1920s and 1930s, which literally strips the soil of large chunks of the West. And there's this idea when FDR and then later Truman come in that something has to be done about this. But this really rubs a lot of farmers up the wrong way. And there's an increasing tension between farmers and the Bureau of Land Management, which will eventually spill over in the late 70s to something called the Sagebrush Rebellion, which will basically help Reagan get elected. And it continues to spill over, right? So in the Western United States, even today, there is a lot of tension between this. So this actually might be for a domestic audience, and this idea of like, well, we should really be suspicious of this government oversight because it's not going to be really very good for the farmer.
We must fight to regain our freedom, or everything is lost. Everything!
Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. Everything is fine.
So it's pretty hilarious to me, actually, in a propaganda film to see it condemning propaganda. And I suppose what you could say is that the state, as far as we know, isn't involved in the production of this piece. But I mean, it's not like the American state wasn't involved in the production of propaganda in the Cold War. I mean, in the 1950s, they would suggest things like Operation Gladio and COINTELPRO, which are organisations like the CIA and the FBI, both domestically and abroad, spending money in producing propaganda to kind of attack leftist and communist groups. It's also kind of ironic as well because 1948 is really the beginning of one of the most famous Red Scares in American history, with McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, where people will lose their jobs and go to jail for being perceived as too left-wing or too communist. So what I would say is it's very interesting that we're seeing here this condemnation of propaganda just as America is about to gear up its state propaganda, where some people are actually taken away and put into prison for the speech they are saying.
Everybody preaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other through class warfare, race hatred, or religious intolerance. You know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives.
As I've already pointed out, this is a very white vision of America. And when someone in 1948 is talking about race conflict, especially if it is a white person, they're not talking about, well, blacks and whites will live equally. What they're talking about is, well, black people are getting, in their terms, uppity, right? There is this deep concern, especially in the South, especially in evangelical colleges like Harding College, that the civil rights movement is undermining unity, that early civil rights campaigners, what they are doing is they are destroying the unity that America is built upon. And the reason we know this is these now 5 white people are condemning this racial minority of Dr. Utopia for preaching race hate, right? Of getting them to think different things.
And we know what to do about it.
And now, gentlemen, no violence, please. And don't throw those bottles. Don't throw those bottles. No.
So this is actually a very common experience for communists and civil rights and socialist leaders, especially in places like the Deep South. Right up until the late 70s, late 80s, communists and socialists like Dr. Utopia here, when they were trying to organise, would be beaten, they would be attacked, they would be sometimes killed. And actually this cartoon at the time was quite controversial because people said it was encouraging violence against what is basically a political agitator, right? Dr. Utopia isn't forcing anything on them, he's selling his ideology. So we have this like tension, I think, between America is this land where earlier in the video you can debate and you can talk, but also if a communist comes to your town, you should throw bottles at him and definitely chase him out of town. So you've probably noticed by now that this particular propaganda piece has pretty high production values, and you wouldn't be wrong. This one episode cost about $80,000, while the whole project, stretching into the 1950s, would cost somewhere in the region of $600,000, which is quite a lot of money now and a staggering sum for the 1940s. So where is this small Christian college in Arkansas getting all this money? Well, that is thanks to their president, one George Stuart Benson, who is the founder of an organisation called the National Education Programme, or the NEP, that's stated goal is to promote faith, constitutional government and free enterprise. But now we have a second question, because where is an organisation founded by a fundamentalist college president and sometime missionary getting all this money? Well, most of it, at least for this initial propaganda cartoon, is coming from the Sloan Foundation, an organisation founded by Alfred P. Sloan, the chief of General Motors. And this might go some way of explaining why this particular cartoon is so obsessed with cars. And this kind of Russian doll of funding is very common in this period, where you have various different organisations funding each other to produce some kind of propaganda. And this method of producing propaganda gives America a massive advantage when it comes to the propaganda war against the communist bloc, because the funding and production methods is diffuse and diverse. You don't always need the government involved to produce propaganda which is essentially supporting the American way of life and American domination of the world.